Looks like we have a good group who have joined us today. Number one, thank you for taking time out of your schedules to join us and our guest speaker, Dr. Hotz, today. It's definitely been an interesting past few months. This is only our third official meeting of the year. It's kind of weird meeting without food. I have to go fix myself lunch here in a little bit, which I wasn't expecting, normally wouldn't expect, but I did have to shower and comb my hair today, though. So, but definitely appreciate everyone's attendance. With this past couple months with the COVID-19, it's changed all of our lives in a large way, and definitely want to do a little shout out to all of our affiliate membership and vendors, and even those who aren't, actual members of our organization. A lot of heroes out there who have done significant work helping all of us through this crisis, between helping provide for property, plant, and equipment. Flint and the Medical Society has done a great job, as well as others. All of our banking friends who have helped many of us with the Paycheck Protection Program and working through other cash challenges. Definitely our technology vendors who have helped us stay connected and testing out telemedicine maybe for the first time for some of us. So again, appreciate all the hard work that everyone has done and continues to do. And we're excited to be able to come together today and just share some camaraderie and definitely some good information from Dr. Hotz. And so at the end of the meeting, we will have a quick Q&A as well as a couple of giveaways. So if you are still in attendance at the end of the meeting, you will qualify for maybe a giveaway. So stay connected. And I guess without further ado, Adriana, let you introduce our guest speaker.
Sure. Thanks, Eric, for that introduction and just the reminder. We're all doing hard work right now, and some of you all are probably at work right now and managing small children at home, possibly. I know that's been the case for me over the past few days, so thank you for what you're doing, really, truly. It's tough for all of us, but we are excited to take a little bit of a break, and I think you're really going to enjoy this, our speaker today. So this is Dr. Kendra Hotz, and she is the Robert R. Waller Chair of Population Health and the Director of the Rhodes College Health Equity Program. She teaches courses in theology, ethics, Africana studies, and urban studies. She's the co-author of several different books and articles, and her research really focuses in on the relationship between religious belonging, social inequalities, and health. She lives in downtown Memphis with her husband and her dog, and I can tell you she has come and spoken to our healthcare administrators and our providers here at Church Health, and every time she comes, she is warmly welcomed, and the information that she gives is definitely eye-opening. So without further ado, Dr. Hotz, take it over.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. I'm really excited to meet this group. What I want to present you with today, I need to remember to share my screen. I, like you all, am still getting used to this new way of talking to each other. What we're going to do today is think through what produces health disparities and what implications that has for clinical care. So a lot of times when you get presentations like this, they'll focus on unconscious bias. And that's an important topic. I do talks on that too. But today what I want to talk about is a different way in which our mindset shapes the way we deliver care. And so instead of talking about unconscious bias as something that's primarily about race or racism, I want us to think about agency bias, which is something about how we frame the choices that people make. So a two-part presentation. The first I'm going to do quite quickly because I suspect this is information that you know pretty well. So this is just by way of reminder. And then I'll have to close out of this and open up a separate set of slides. And then we're going to be thinking through what housing and neighborhoods look like, especially here in Memphis, and what that has to do with healthcare. So here we go, measuring the justice of a society in the bodies of its people. All right, I want us to look briefly at 3 health disparities associated with 3 different social determinants of health. And this is the material I think that you already know reasonably well. So what we're looking at here is Shelby County Health Department data on life expectancy in 2 different zip codes, 3800106 and 38017. And what you're seeing there is a 13-year life expectancy gap between Soulsville and Collierville. And if you just sort of imaginatively go to those 2 places, you probably have a pretty good sense of some of the things that are driving those differences in life expectancy across those 2 zip codes. They are about 26 miles apart. So you're gaining about a half a year of life expectancy for every half mile that you drive to the east. You certainly see differences in food availability, housing quality, road and transportation infrastructure. You also see significant racial differences and, of course, socioeconomic differences. This is a second social determinant of health, socioeconomic status. And in this case, what we're looking at is type 2 diabetes. So this is a classic health wealth gradient that you've all seen probably hundreds of times. Studies like this have been replicated all over the world for decades, ever since the 1968 Whitehall study in England that established that there does not appear to be a threshold effect for the relationship between socioeconomic status and health outcomes, that it's a gradient, and that the steeper social inequalities are, the steeper the curve is. In every society, the wealthier you are, the healthier you are. And in societies with dramatic social stratification, you get this really steep curve. This one is more complicated. On this slide, we're going to be looking at education as a social determinant of health, and we're combining it with racialized identities. Notice I did not say race there. Race is not biologically real. It's socially and politically real. And so the way race plays out in our health is really about how we racialize identity, how we stigmatize it. So this is infant mortality, measured 1 death per 1,000 live births. And what you're seeing there on the left side of the graph is high school dropouts. In the middle, high school graduates. Next to that, women with some college. And next to that, women who are college graduates. It's a complicated graph, so let's just look at 2 things. I hope you can see my mouse here. These are white women who dropped out of high school, who completed high school, who completed some college, and who finished college. So there you're seeing an education health gradient or health wealth gradient for infant mortality among white women. And then if you look at African American women, you also have that same gradient, but you see that the whole thing is skewed upward. Probably the most striking thing about this graphic is comparing this white woman who dropped out of high school to this African American woman who completed college. This is data from 2016, and this is the first time I've seen this data where the African American woman had a slim benefit over the white woman who dropped out of high school. In graphs prior to this, white high school dropouts always had better birth outcomes than African American women who graduated college. So here we're seeing some improvement, but it's still startling that the African American woman has such a marginal advantage over the white woman who dropped out of high school. And it's an interesting thing. When I first started seeing these kinds of graphs, I thought, well, maybe there is some, maybe there's something biological there. And it turns out, I mean, of course that was wrong, and I'm PhD is in religious studies, not biology, so I would have known that more quickly if I had been a different person. But anthropologists did a really interesting study following African women who had immigrated to the US. So women who grew up on the continent and immigrated here had birth outcomes that were nearly identical to their white peers compared based on education. And then when they followed the daughters of those women, so African girls who were raised in the US, in that one generation, their infant mortality rates jumped so that they looked just like those of their African American peers. I'm going to skip this slide. I'll just say briefly what it's about. This is one other way in which we get determinants of health disparities, and that is not just social determinants, but also clinical determinants. And so medical racism. Many of you may have seen this page out of a nursing textbook from 2017. This was a Pearson nursing textbook, and it was designed to train nurses to be culturally sensitive to differences in how people experience and report their pain. But in fact, what it did was just replicate all kinds of really horrifying stereotypes. So it says things like Jews are vocal and demanding, Blacks essentially exaggerate their pain, it lumps Arabs and Muslims together, even though most Muslims aren't Arabs and some Arabs aren't Muslim. It's just a weird collection of stereotypes. And really striking is that there is no cultural competence training for white. The assumption, I think, is just that white is normal, that white people are sort of neutral in how they report their pain, that they can be trusted to report things factually, and it may assume that the nurse herself is white. So this is one other way in which we see determinants of health disparities. For this, really what you do is unconscious bias training, and that's something separate from what we'll be doing today. All right, so let's just think for a minute about why these social and economic differences become disparities. And here I really do want to go quite quickly because I think you know this. The first answer is adversity and toxic stress. We know that our ancestors evolved to be extra sensitive to any situation in which they sensed that they lacked control because it was a predator-prey situation. And if you were not in control, that might mean a big predator was nearby. And so your body would throw itself into fight or flight response, releasing lots of cortisol. And cortisol would make your heart pump really fast so that you can run away. Or I assume you could also fight the predator, but on the fight or flight spectrum, I'm pretty far on the runaway end of things. So it also releases a coagulating agent into your blood, which I have only recently learned how to pronounce, fibrinogen. And that coagulating agent would ensure that you don't bleed to death if you're injured. And then finally, it will also slow down how quickly you use up glucose in your blood because you want to have a ready supply of energy as you run away. Those are all incredibly useful things if you're experiencing a very episodic and acute episode of stress, something like being chased by a lion. That's a short-term kind of stress because you get caught, you know, or you get away. And in both scenarios, you're not stressed anymore. But the stresses we experience are not acute and episodic. They are systemic and chronic. And that means that the cortisol keeps treating our bodies as though the problem is a predator. And we keep having that elevated heart rate, which is associated with things like hypertension. We keep having the thick blood, right, the coagulating agent, and that leads to strokes. And we keep having those high blood glucose levels, and that, of course, is the very definition of diabetes. And so what we're seeing there is that people who don't feel like they have control in their lives, and maybe that's kind of all of us right now, but in ordinary circumstances, the people least likely to feel like they have control in their lives are the ones who are stigmatized. They might be stigmatized by virtue of being a sexual or gender minority. They might be stigmatized by being a racial or ethnic minority, by being undocumented with their immigration status. And then, of course, poverty itself will make you feel out of control all the time. You don't know how you're going to pay the rent. You don't know if you can afford a safe neighborhood for your children to play in, things like that. So the first reason why those social differences become disparities is simply the result of our bodies still functioning as though we were living in a predator-prey situation. This is a really great joke about eating brains, but it's not going to work on Zoom. Okay. What the heck? All right. Second way in which social and economic differences become health disparities is through weathering and the life course perspective. So by weathering, we're thinking about the sort of metaphor. Imagine that you paint a home that is situated on the ocean, and the front of the home takes the brunt of the weather, the salt water, the wind, and the back of it is protected from those elements. If you come back 10 years later, the front of the house will look older than the back of the house. A similar kind of effect happens in human bodies, that the effect of having that heightened allostatic load, that's just the name for having all that extra cortisol in your blood, the effect of that heightened allostatic load over time is that it ages you, it wears you down, it leaves your body in a chronically stimulated state, which produces inflammation. And in a way, we can just do a blood draw and look at inflammation markers like C-reactive proteins, and that will tell us the degree to which people feel out of control in their lives. And those are pretty good predictors, not only of conditions like stroke, hypertension, and diabetes, but also of conditions across the spectrum of health that are associated with aging. And then finally, a third way in which we get a kind of social forces under our skin is through biological embedding. And this is especially associated with ACEs, so adverse childhood experiences. We know that there are certain kinds of toxic stresses that can happen early in childhood that tell the child's body, look out, there's a predator out there and it's always going to be out there, and you need to have a hair trigger fight or flight response. And so it can cause an epigenetic shift, which means that the tendency to a heightened allostatic load is biologically embedded in that child for life. And so when we expose children to certain kinds of really toxic stresses, and I think it's inarguable that what's happening to children at our borders right now is an example of that, those will have population health consequences for decades to come. All right. That was, I'm going to stop sharing that and share something else now. That was a brief description of how we get health disparities in the first place. Now what I want to do is spend a little bit of time thinking about what do we do about that? Those are obviously not medical problems. These are social problems. But they show up in the clinic. You know, they show up in the form of diabetes patients. They show up in the form of infant mortality. I should have mentioned that cortisol is also the hormone that prompts uterine contractions, and so it's associated with premature births. I want to make sure, are you all seeing a screen that says agency bias and structural competence? Can somebody unmute and give a thumbs up?
Yes, Kendra.
Okay, very good, thanks. I was worried that I wasn't actually sharing my screen because I'm getting a weird message at the top of it. All right, so let's think about what is agency bias, what is structural competence. Let's start with a meme. I grew up white working class in rural southern Indiana, which has a higher per capita Ku Klux Klan membership than this area of Tennessee does. So I grew up in a pretty racist area of the country. I didn't know that was true when I was a kid. We thought that we were north of the Mason-Dixon line and that somehow inoculated us against racism. So white, working class, pretty low income. And most of my friends from childhood are still living in those kinds of circumstances. And so this is a little unscientific experiment that I conducted on Facebook. I've just been observing the friends from high school that I'm connected to on Facebook and the kinds of things they share. And memes like this are among the most popular things that they share. So their peers who are working as cash registers at Walmart and in gas station convenience stores really like this kind of thing. They like the message that says, you are one decision away from a totally different life. And then another one, your life is the result of the choices you make. If you don't like your life, it's time to start making different choices. They really like these kinds of messages, this idea that I deserve what I have, that I've earned it, and that when bad things happen to me, it's my own stupid fault for making bad choices. But we've got a lot of studies showing us that these things are really not true. Our tendency to explain things in terms of individual choice can be called agency bias, or the myth of meritocracy. So one study shows that the number one reason, number one thing associated with being a success as an entrepreneur in the US is having been born into an affluent household. That makes sense, right? I mean, entrepreneurs have to take enormous risks. And if taking a big risk and losing it all means that you have to move back into your parents' basement, then you might do that. But if taking an enormous risk and losing everything leaves you destitute with no way to work your way out of it, then you're probably not going to take a risk like that. And that means you're less likely to become a successful business owner. Likewise, a recent study showed that to work your way out of poverty, you need 20 years in which nothing of significance goes wrong. So to dig yourself, or to sort of climb out of poverty, you need 20 years when you don't have a car breakdown, 20 years with no significant health problems, 20 years with no episodes of unemployment, and certainly 20 years without a pandemic. So when you put those two things together, what you're seeing is that a lot of what we have in life depends on the circumstances we were born into. Paul Farmer defines structural violence this way: physical and psychological harm resulting from exploitative and unjust political, social, and economic systems. Two population health researchers, Dorothy Roberts and Jonathan Metzl, have come up with this term structural competence to describe what they think clinics and healthcare providers need in order to work with people who are experiencing structural violence. They say that what they need is structural competence. And so what we're going to do is contrast agency bias with structural competence. All right. So first of all, when we talk about agency bias, we're talking about our social location, the situation into which we're born, the way we were raised, the assumptions we make, what we think makes the world good. I'm going to compare two children, one named Geoffrey and one named Chad. Geoffrey is African American, Chad is white. They're both about 8 years old. Geoffrey I actually knew as an 8-year-old, and Chad is a construct of my imagination, but I think there are plenty of children like him. Geoffrey lives in Binghampton, a neighborhood with very similar demographics to 38106, and Chad lives in Collierville. And we're going to use this geological metaphor to describe these two children. Chad lives on a mesa, which is a flat-topped mountain, and Geoffrey lives on a hoodoo, which is, first of all, just really fun to say. And a hoodoo is a rock spire. And so we're going to think about this metaphor of how much surface area you have to think about agency bias and structural competence. All right, so where do we stand? When a patient comes into your clinic, what kinds of choices are they able to make? And what kinds of chances do they have to make those choices? So we're thinking about life choices and life chances. If you think of choices as one word for agency and chances as the word for structures, then what you've got here is Chad standing on his mesa, and you see that he has a lot of opportunity to make choices. And that's important because the way we learn, the way we improve is by making mistakes and recovering. Chad can make a lot of mistakes before he suffers a catastrophe. The catastrophe would be falling off the edge of the cliff. If he falls off the edge of the cliff, it's going to take him 20 years with nothing going wrong to climb his way back up onto that mesa. But he can make a lot of mistakes before he experiences catastrophe. He's got this really wide supportive structure that will allow him to try out different things to see what will work and what won't work, and maybe to become a successful entrepreneur. Geoffrey is living in Binghampton on this rock spire, this hoodoo. And you see that he also has choices he can make. He has agency. We never want to deprive our patients of that. It's incredibly health destructive to be told that you don't have any options. You want to expand the options your patients have as much as you possibly can, but you also want to be realistic. Geoffrey and his family can make fewer missteps before they suffer catastrophe. The structure supporting their agency is simply not as broad as Chad's is. Now, what we want to do is learn how to think with structural competence instead of agency bias. Because when catastrophe strikes, we tend to look at the immediate choices that people made and say, well, That explains it. You are diabetic because you're eating too many sugary snacks. You are suffering hypertension because you're not taking your medication correctly, or because you are constantly getting into stressful situations. Instead, what we want to do is learn how to ask, why is it that way? We want to learn to practice this root cause analysis, which many of you, I'm sure, have used to figure out what's really going on. You want to say, why is it that way, about 5 times. I'm not a math person, so there are 6 of them in this presentation, but we're not going to go through all 6, so don't worry about that. All right, why is it that way? First thing you can look at is family of origin, and this will tell us something about those ACE scores. But don't just think in terms of the family of origin for your pediatric patients. Also think about the family of origin for your adult patients. What have they experienced as children, and how might those experiences have embedded themselves in a way that makes it really difficult for this particular patient to manage a chronic condition? So Geoffrey and Chad are fortunate. They both have really solid families of origin. They're both living in a 2-parent household. They both have some extended family in the area, and they both belong to active faith communities where they've got kind of good opportunities to socialize with a supportive community. So they've got a lot going in their favor. Why is it that way? Now here's probably the place where you said, what? Why is she going to talk about Social Security? Give me a second. So in 1935, when Social Security was instituted, there were senators from the southern states who refused to vote for it if their African-American constituents could benefit. This is in the middle of the Great Depression. And the goal was not simply to make sure that the elders didn't fall into destitution. The goal was also to build intergenerational wealth by making sure that the sandwich generation could dedicate their resources to their children, so that their children could get all of that benefit, because the parents didn't need to worry about grandparents not having a place to live or food to eat. What Congress did was write a provision into the bill that said that you were ineligible for Social Security if you worked in domestic or farm labor. At the time, the US was 90% white. Get that in your head for a minute, 90% white. 26% of those who were excluded from Social Security were African American. That meant there was a wild, disproportionate representation of African Americans among those who were unable to devote their resources to their children. They had to split them between parents and children. And that's not evenly distributed across the country, because go to a place like Vermont, and to this day, I think Vermont is like 99% white. Whereas in the Mississippi Delta, we've got a much higher concentration of African Americans. And here in Memphis, I think we're at something like 65%. That means that Geoffrey's great-great-grandparents probably did not have Social Security. And it means that Chad's did. And so you start this snowball where Chad's family is building up resources that help them let that health wealth gradient work in their favor. The mace is getting wider for them, whereas Geoffrey is still on his hoodoo, on his rock spire. The second way that happened is with redlining, which is also a 1930s era practice by the agency that is the predecessor of the current Federal Housing Authority. And what they did was rank different neighborhoods, A, B, C, and D, A being the best, D being the worst. And they set interest rates based on what grade the neighborhood got. So a D-rated neighborhood would really be a difficult place to purchase a home, to make home improvements. It would be very difficult to get a small business loan. It would be difficult for even churches to take out loans to improve or expand their buildings. All kinds of things happened when you got labeled an at-risk neighborhood. Let's just take a look at where Geoffrey and Chad live. So this is a redlined map of Memphis. Just to get you oriented, this green spot is Overton Park. The green down here is MLK Riverside Park. All right, here we are in Overton Park. I'm actually sitting right here, right now at Rhodes College. So the blue around Overton Park is the Evergreen neighborhood. It's a middle-class neighborhood, and it was in the 1930s too, and it got a B rating. Just to the south, an affluent neighborhood, both in 1932 and now, Central Gardens, that got an A, that's why it's green. Over here, you can see one of the most affluent neighborhoods in the city, Chickasaw Gardens. Again, it got ranked an A, and so it's green. This is Orange Mound. You can see that it's redlined. It got a D. This is 38106. It's also redlined. It got a D. This is Binghampton, redlined, got a D. Right next to it is a neighborhood of mansions. It was a very affluent neighborhood, and somehow it got rated a C. And you can probably guess why. This was an era when real estate agents took an oath of office that they would do nothing to encourage integration. They would not show or sell homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods or to white Americans in communities of color. This neighborhood is directly adjacent to a redlined neighborhood, and as a result, it was labeled at risk. At risk of what? At risk of integration. So what you're seeing here is that Memphis still pretty much looks like this, except for this area downtown, which was redlined in the 30s, but now has had significant community public dollars put into it in order to sort of bring it up. But these consequences from the 1930s still live with us. Our neighborhoods still look like this. Why is it that way? They still look like this partly because of a late 1940s program by the Federal Housing Authority to offer low interest rate loans to returning GIs. So most people could not afford a home in the 1940s. It was not considered part of the American dream back then. There was a public relations campaign from the federal government to encourage people to purchase homes. And to make that possible, you could get a low interest rate loan, even if you only had a 1 or 2% down payment. Well, Chad's family would have been eligible for an FHA loan. In fact, just recently, I had some students who were reading about this material, and they called their parents and said, "Mom and Dad, when you bought your first home, what kind of mortgage did you get?" And they were stunned and sort of shocked to learn that their parents had started out with FHA loans. It's a very common way for people even now to purchase a first home. The trick is, between 1945 and 1962, fewer than 1% of FHA loans went to people of color. So not just African Americans, but Chinese Americans, Latinos, anyone who was considered a person of color. Fewer than 1% went to those people. So what that means is that those communities didn't have access to building up home equity. Not only that, but FHA homes were really hard to buy an existing home. You really needed to build a new one. And so what happened was people took their FHA loans and they went out to the suburbs and built new homes there. It was too expensive to buy a single plot of land in the city. But since developers had this big, open land where nobody lived, and this is the same period when the Department of Transportation began building the interstate highway system. So everybody could move out of the city. They would have good transportation infrastructure to get them to the jobs in the city. They had new homes in the suburbs. And the result was that businesses and banks and even churches sort of pulled up business from the city, evacuated the core city, and moved out to the suburbs, leaving Geoffrey's family and other children of color in the city, while cities were divesting from things like public transportation. Once your white homeowners no longer needed streetcars, you took the streetcars out and no more public buses or that ran very infrequently, and everybody out in the suburbs started buying automobiles. So what you're seeing is that there's this kind of snowball rolling downhill where benefits like the ability to buy a home, to get a low interest rate, to get the benefit of the doubt in how your neighborhood is characterized, even to get Social Security, all those things depended on being white. The thing I forgot to tell you about redlining, even if your neighborhood had all of the attributes of an A quality neighborhood, you still got a D if it was a minority neighborhood or if it was an integrated neighborhood. So even though Binghampton was a nice middle-class neighborhood, it got ranked D. If you look at the quality of the housing stock in Binghampton, it's lovely. It would have been a relatively low-income middle-class neighborhood, but a neighborhood that should have been ranked a B. It got ranked D simply because it was an integrated neighborhood. All right, I'll move a little more quickly here. Urban renewal. Urban renewal is what happens when the result of Social Security, Federal Housing Authority loans, and redlining means that you have so seriously suppressed property values in a neighborhood, and then the government wants to put something there. And so they practice eminent domain, purchase the homes at very, very low rates, destroy them, and then build something big. Like what? Like Sam Cooper. So this is the Binghampton neighborhood. And here, the yellow line you see is Sam Cooper, and the green line is Broad Avenue. If you ever go and visit Broad Avenue, you'll see that it's a nice little main street. In fact, it was the main street for the Binghampton neighborhood. It was a very simple thing to walk a few blocks and you would find a grocery store and a hardware store, a five and dime, a pharmacy. But then the Department of Transportation decided to build I-40 and to build it right through the center of Memphis. It only got stopped because of an environmental interests group that managed to take a case all the way to the Supreme Court to stop I-40 from plowing through Overton Park. Sam Cooper is what I-40 would have been. The interstate did not get stopped until it had already destroyed a good bit of Binghampton. If you go to Broad Avenue today, you will find that the businesses there are not businesses that serve the people of Binghampton. You have to cross an interstate on foot in order to get to Broad Avenue. Instead, Broad Avenue is a variety of businesses catering to a more affluent crowd. And so what we're seeing are signs of gentrification in Binghampton. In fact, if you look at this map, it shows something funny about my preferences, because when you draw up a map of a neighborhood in Google, it shows you things it thinks you care about. And what Google thinks I care about is Victory Bike Studio, which is right here, and the Rec Room, which is a microbrewery there. So Kendra cares about bikes and beer. This is true. But these are clearly businesses that cater to people like me and not the residents of Binghampton. So why is it that way? It's also that way because of environmental racism. If you take a map of the United States and overlay it with our densest concentrations of minority residents, and overlay that with maps of our densest concentrations of things like asthma, diabetes, obesity, they're a perfect match. Then, if you take a map of our most toxic waste sites and overlay them on all of those other maps, again, it is a perfect match. In fact, we will locate our hazardous wastes in a middle-class minority neighborhood before we will locate them in a lower-class white neighborhood. Memphis has more EPA Superfund sites than any place in the US, 173. The Superfund sites are the ones designated so dangerous to human health that they are the highest priorities for cleaning up. Here's one in Memphis. This is the Superfund site, the Memphis Depot. It's a munitions depot in South Memphis, not too far from the airport. And what you see there in green is that these neighborhoods are greater than 90% African American. It's also not coincidental that these are some of our lowest income neighborhoods in Memphis. What you're seeing here is racialized poverty that's the result of decades of policy decisions. Not sort of accidental, but policy decisions that were designed to disadvantage African Americans. This is a really revealing photo, I think. Remember that redlined map where I showed you Overton Park and MLK Riverside? These two parks were designed to be great public amenities. Overton Park was designed to be for white Memphians and Riverside Park for black Memphians. This is when the city was segregated, still kind of segregated. And you saw that I-40 did not plow through Overton Park because the environmental movement took it to the Supreme Court and stopped it. This is a picture of MLK Park. MLK is bisected. It was just Riverside before it was named MLK. Riverside Park is bisected by I-55. If you look directly to the east of I-55, you'll find a neighborhood whose housing quality looks quite similar to Binghampton. You cannot walk from that neighborhood to Riverside safely. You would have to cross 7 lanes of a literal interstate. There's a couple of little places, if you know the neighborhood really well, where you can figure out a way to get into that park on foot or on bike, but it's really difficult. And the result is that these debates we get in Overton Park about whether people should be able to park in there don't happen in Riverside Park because you have to drive to get there. And so a lot of the park is covered in asphalt. I took this picture standing in the middle of one of those giant parking lots looking just to the south. That's the Valero refinery smokestack. The prevailing winds in Memphis mean that the particulates from that smokestack end up in 38106, which has our densest concentration of asthma patients in Memphis. And asthma is also the #1 reason why school children in Memphis miss school. So what we're seeing here is a combination of a lot of things resulting in the city of Memphis having patterns of racialized poverty that largely explain why Geoffrey and his family have different outcomes from Chad and his family. Now here's the thing. I don't expect anybody to memorize the history of US housing policy. That's my job. I'm a college professor. I'm a geek like that, right? But you can say, there's a story there. There's a story that explains why I can't just blame the health conditions on the patient for the choices they made. There's a story there that explains the kinds of choices that they make. And any patient who comes through your clinic doors, you can say, I don't know what the story is, but I'll bet there is one. That's what it means to overcome agency bias and instead opt in favor of structural competence. Structural competence just means that what you're looking for is the real explanation for what's going on. You want to say, what's happening here? What can explain this? And when you start asking those structural questions, then you begin to realize that you're going to have to organize your clinics in ways that address the social determinants of health in a really direct way if you want to have better outcomes. Okay, that was a lot from me, so I'm going to stop talking and take some questions.
Hey, Kendra, thanks. That was really great information. We had a couple of questions come in. The first is, I think, pretty basic. I mean, you've kind of outlined, I think, some issues that we all were at least somewhat familiar with, but you probably have shed a different light on some of them as well. So how do we even begin to address something like this?
Okay. First thing is, I would strongly encourage every clinic to begin both ACEs screening and social determinant screening. Just start gathering some data. I want to encourage you to be really careful with ACEs screening because it can be a little sensitive. People can feel blamed. They can feel judged. You want to be really careful about that. But just finding out some basic things like, do you have safe, stable housing? Have you experienced food insecurity over the past month? Just kind of get a sense of where your people are. Do some social determinant screening. That data is just tremendously helpful. The second thing is make sure that everyone who has direct contact with patients spends some time getting structural competence training. That might mean something like you start a book club and you read medical apartheid, read medical bondage. I can give you loads and loads of books and articles and things. And you can just say once a month, we're going to read an article together that exposes us to these realities so that we get used to thinking in these terms. The problem is you have to default to structural explanations, and we're Americans. We don't do that. We default to agency explanations. We default to the meme that says your life is the result of the choices you make. So just those two things. Start screening for social determinants. Get yourself in a relationship with a social worker who can help you address some of those things. And then second, train yourselves to default to structural competence. The reason for that is very simple. Nothing will disrupt the ability to form a therapeutic alliance with your patients. Nothing will disrupt it faster than a sense of being blamed. So if people feel like you are judging them or blaming them, even when things are their fault, I mean, that happens, right? But if people feel judged or blamed, they shut down and you can't form a therapeutic alliance. So to prevent that, we all have to train ourselves to do this thing that's going to feel unnatural. And the unnatural thing is going to be to ask, what else is going on here?
So where can we find some of those screening tools?
Oh, this is a great question. Let me after the fact send you a couple of screening tools. Some of them are just like the size of a postcard. And when people come and sign in at the front desk, they can take the postcard, just click a few boxes, you collect that. You may actually be able right that day to say, here's where the nearest food bank is or something like that. But apart from being able to do actually something for that individual, just starting to get a sense of the data will be useful. And like I said, some of them are the size of a postcard. Let me find a couple and send them to you after this.
We also had a couple of requests for the slides, if that's possible. If you're comfortable sharing those, we'll share them with the group as well.
Yeah, in fact, I think I was supposed to already send those to you and I forgot. I'll do that soon.
No worries. We'll get it up as part of our post-meeting wrap-up.
Okay.
Another question that came in was, you know, the medical lens on the dynamics that you outlined are most physicians are white. A lot of, it's probably safe to say most of our other providers as well are white. And a lot of us, I think, very genuinely experience those white guilt feelings. You know, any guidance on how to process through that? Because if we, you know, I could see someone having that in the back of their mind as we start an ACE screening tool in our practice, for example. So any guidance on that?
Yeah. So the first thing is I've gotten to where I'm going to overstate this. Avoid cultural competence training like the plague. Cultural competence training reinforces to us that we are the experts. Now I'm competent. Now I know, I've got this bullet pointed list of things about your culture, and now I know something about you. And that actually backfires on us. And then second, totally give up on the model of medicine that says you should be colorblind, because you're not. I'm not, none of us are, right? We're all socialized to see race. We do. And we unconsciously make associations with it. That's not something to blame ourselves for. It is something to acknowledge as true and to train ourselves about. So do two things. Get cultural humility training, and I can link you to a source on that, and get intercultural communication training. So intercultural communication teaches you how to form that therapeutic alliance across differences of culture and value. As it turns out, the college is right now in the midst of producing a whole series of lectures. The two that you just saw are the kind of gateway lectures. We're gonna have a whole series of lectures on social determinants, and it includes things like cultural humility training, intercultural communication. So once we have those available, I'll send you links, and you're welcome to make use of those.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. I think this group has really been exposed to the ACEs dynamic a lot in the last 2 years. So this is the first time we visited it again in a while. So that would be really helpful. Eric, that's all the questions we have. I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Okay. All right, Clint. Thank you. Dr. Hotz, thank you so much. Definitely appreciate that presentation. And yes, as soon as we get that, we will make that available on our website for everyone to be able to look at, as well as having this presentation on the website. So Allison, we're going to have a couple of quick drawings if you're able to do that. We will figure out a way to get it to you. So let's do, I'm going to say just two $50 gift cards, and if you'll randomly select two individuals.
Excellent. So I'm using our attendees as 15 folks with a random number generator, which says our first winner is number 8, which is Catherine Montgomery.
All right.
Congratulations.
Eric, you had no part in orchestrating that, right?
I cannot take credit nor blame. So
Scouts, Girl Scouts honor, totally random.
Right. Catherine works in my office, for those who don't know.
Okay, and then the next one.
The cat did it, so it's.
I know, right? Blame it on my cat. Was number 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Jennifer Wallen.
Good deal.
All right. Congratulations.
We will follow up here in the next few days and get those gift cards out to you. Again, everyone, thank you for joining today. Dr. Hotz, thank you again. And everyone stay safe, stay well, and we will meet again soon. Thank you.
Bye, guys.